If you want to drive somewhere, you can pick up your phone and punch the address into Google and you'll get some pretty solid suggestions. But this just isn't the case for taking transit if you pick up your phone and use your default mapping app. And why is that? Taking transit is one of the best things you can do to save money, the planet, and time. But take an unfamiliar transit trip or even try to use some of the same features that you see in mapping and navigation apps that you can use when driving, and you'll realize that the transit mapping and navigation space is a lot less developed than you might expect. Now that's not to say that mapping apps haven't been great for transit. I personally think they have been. A good mapping app can be a great way to see what kind of transit's around you and when it comes, without having to dive into transit agency websites or just trying to use transit in a place where wayfinding materials and information aren't exactly always present, like a lot of suburban bus stops where I grew up. But with all that being said, why oh why is the experience so clunky? It's not nearly as seamless as with driving. Well, one of the big issues I see is that mapping apps did driving first. And to be honest, even though this is a transit channel, choosing driving as the first thing to do kind of made sense. And that's because the way you navigate when you're driving isn't that dissimilar from the way you might navigate when you're walking or cycling, as long as you remove highways, add paths, and avoid big hills. Transit, on the other hand, is an entirely different paradigm when it comes to how you plan your trip, with different operators, routes, scheduling, and all kinds of other considerations. There's also a huge issue around standardization. While some countries, like say the Netherlands, everyone's favorite urban and transit paradise, are really heavily standardized in their transit system design and wayfinding nationwide, road design and road wayfinding is often standardized across an international or even continental basis. Roads are also just less complicated than transit. There are a few main types of roads, and then the only real difference you see from one road to the next is whether it is a smaller version of that road with less lanes or a larger version with more lanes. Compared to roadways, there are tons of different transit modes, which we talk about on this channel, from metros to light rail to trams to buses to ferries to cable cars to funiculars. There are so many modes of transit, and they all operate with some unique and different properties. At the same time, the way cities do things as basic as naming routes or communicating service shutdowns varies widely from one place to the next. And while GTFS, the Google Transit Feed Specification, did a lot to help standardize things, it still is far from perfect, and it doesn't seem to be getting a lot of love these days. And the thing with GTFS, even as it is it's a bit of a garbage in, garbage out situation. Some transit agencies, even big ones, don't fully support all of its features. Looking at you, TTC. There's also some big issues around locations and connectivity. While driving, you almost always have a cellular signal, and you also almost always know exactly where you are. And thus, reroutes and the like are pretty simple. At the same time, many metro systems, like Toronto for example, have poor or no internet and location services within their systems. And that means that if you find out mid-trip that there's a delay or some reason you need to go in a different direction, it might be a bit tricky to do that while you're actually using a metro system, for example. This is also an issue because the best transit route to take changes on a minute-to-minute basis, depending on the alignment of different services. The reflection of the real-world transit system in most mapping apps is also quite problematic. For example, the way closures or maintenance are communicated from system to system isn't at all consistent. Sometimes, for example, a closure is listed as a sort of general alert about the system, and so if you plan a specific trip that uses a closed section of route, you might not even be notified. If you've looked at maps recently, you might have also noticed that the way bus stops are shown is very inconsistent. Sometimes bus stops aren't actually located where the bus stop is, and this can be a problem because bus stops do sometimes move with construction and the like. But that becomes an even larger issue with transit stations or centers or loops. These things are just wildly non-standardized. Another issue is that delays on a transit system happen in real time, and well, when you're driving, it's pretty easy to see where a delay is based on traffic. The same isn't necessarily true with transit, where things like equipment issues or staffing problems can be a huge contributor to a delay or a service issue. And beyond the lack of connectivity with these issues, even if the data is available, mapping apps usually don't take advantage of it, and so you're stuck looking at Twitter to find out if something is going wrong. Schedules are yet another problem. While a lot of frequent transit routes, especially those that operate in mixed traffic, don't really run to their schedule, it's more of a guideline, this doesn't necessarily make them actually less useful or usable as a transit service, but it does mean that planning your trip based on the schedule you find online might not have a huge point to it. At the same time, going from A to B, the fastest transit routes often aren't as obvious as the fastest driving routes as well. Well, when driving, it's pretty uncommon that you would drive the opposite direction of where you're headed for any substantial distance, given the massive differences in speeds between different transit modes, from regional rail to local buses. It can make a lot of sense to head back to a regional rail station if it means going this way faster. And that's not even with considering things like frequency, where even a fast route that operates infrequently could get you to your destination slower than a slow route that operates more frequently. And then you have issues from route to route. Reliability is often not consistent on a transit network. Specific road areas that have narrow sections or a lot of parked cars or potentially double parked cars can massively disrupt transit lines on a regular basis, especially when cities aren't more on the ball. And while for drivers, there's a traffic map that lets you see which parts of the road network are congested, I'm not aware of a transit app that incorporates things like dedicated lanes and queue jumps and even less formalized things like roads that just tend to have traffic that flows better for transit. The inconsistent language used from region to region is also a big problem. When you're driving on a highway, exits tend to be numbered, and that's a pretty consistent thing around the world. But when you're riding on transit, stops are often denoted in different ways, from northbound to southbound to NB to SB to stop to loop to hub to exchange to transit center to station. There's just so many different pieces of language that are used to describe the same or even different things. Now, all of these differences between how driving works and driving works in an app, and how transit works and how transit works in an app, are kind of the fundamentals, in my personal opinion, of why navigating with apps on transit can be so difficult. But the truth is, the way systems are represented isn't even the biggest issue. There are more fundamental differences between driving and transit. If you want to drive somewhere, you can just get in your car, load up directions, and go. Transit trips just aren't always a when you want thing. They can be with frequent services and metros, and that's great. But even in good systems, that's just not always the case. And trust me, that's not a bad thing. I've said in previous videos that when you're used to one form of transportation, like cars, it can be hard to consider how other modes are different, and indeed sometimes superior. This same effect of people not being familiar with something and trying to see it through the same lens that they always have is evidenced with electric cars. Despite being better than old cars in so many ways, and most people having phones that they plug in every night, people are afraid they won't be able to go to a randomly located gas station to pump an incredibly dangerous and poisonous liquid into their vehicle on a regular basis. A liquid they cannot make themselves and that actually needs to get shipped to gas sites on a regular basis by trucks. In the same way, people often look at transit and expect it to be like driving, and so they are inevitably let down. But the reality is, transit is just different than driving, and in many ways, it's far, far better. With a decent transit system, you could sometimes wait as much as an hour to actually get on a vehicle. But for that potential inconvenience, you benefit. That could be a seamless one-seat ride, or a faster trip that could be even faster than if you drove and minimizes your time on transit. At the same time, it's all far better for the environment, more affordable, and just more efficient in terms of resources. Anyone who regularly uses a transit service tends to get familiar with when it actually shows up, and that means that regular users will often tell you that you don't have to wait for an hour, you just show up at the station or stop when the vehicle is going to arrive. You might see the issue here. With driving, you are to some extent the master of your own destiny, but when you actually get going in a car, it's far more inconsistent with how long it takes to get to your destination. Sure, if it's the middle of the night, you might be able to fly along dangerously through your city, but during a peak hour, you could have crashes, accidents, congestion. It's all just less consistent. Transit requires a bit more of a partnership, and this creates a problem for apps. Say you want to take a trip right now. The best driving trip in 10 minutes is unlikely to be very different from the best driving trip right now. And just largely with driving, the time it takes to get to your destination fluctuates only a little over the period of a day, and it's very predictable. Rush hour is slower, middle of the night or the midday period is easier and faster. But with transit, the particular moment you decide to travel can make a huge difference in how long your trip takes, and there are a lot more fluctuations throughout the day in how fast trips can be executed. That's because transit networks for longer trips almost always rely on transfers, and this is actually a good thing that makes the network more efficient and more convenient. But what it does mean is that getting on an earlier vehicle, even a few minutes earlier, can have a cascading effect on what other trips you can connect to. This means that while you might want to take a short trip every 5 or 10 minutes, that can be done efficiently. But for longer trips, systems need to sync up, and so a very convenient trip might only happen every 20 or 30 minutes. Now, this is why systems like in Switzerland use pulse timetables and clock-based scheduling to make it so that transfers are basically always convenient and seamless. But those models create a ton of people power to create, and I'm just not sure they're universally applicable. Ultimately, the fact that your trip might be faster by leaving just a few minutes later is just one of those weird things that makes transit really different from driving. And while some apps do try to incorporate this notion of scheduling and pulsing to an extent, there are still issues. Ultimately, when driving, it's easy to predict the best routes, and there are usually only a few routes that make the most sense. But with transit, there could be tons of different routes because of the differences in speed and frequency and reliability. And so while it is our tendency as consumers and consumers of mapping apps to just type in where we want to go and hit go, sometimes it might make more sense for transit apps to tell us when we should consider traveling, based on patterns of where we've been in the past and where we might want to go in the future. The issue, as I mentioned here, is that the information apps have just often isn't perfect. And that doesn't necessarily mean that reality is so much worse than what you'll find online. Often I find Google Maps in particular is more pessimistic about travel time and transfer distance than reality, which means that if I get on a bus based on a schedule that was suggested in Google Maps, often I'll get to the next station faster than the app predicted. And that actually means I have more options for vehicles I can transfer to. But reopening the app in the middle of my trip to try to figure out the best way doesn't really make sense. I'll just get on the next vehicle heading in the direction I want to go. At the same time, when riding transit, environmental factors just matter a lot more than when you're in an air-conditioned, sealed, quiet car. When driving, you rarely have to consider whether you'd like to walk across a large street or maybe even climb some stairs in the middle of your trip, but these are legitimate things you might want to avoid or go toward in your transit trip planning. The issue here is that knowing the inconvenient truths about the routes that seem like they should be the fastest is the kind of information that people have, but transit apps generally don't. Apps can do useful things like help me avoid transferring, but can they help keep me out of the rain? Or can they help make sure I don't have to sit at a bus stop outside of the house of that weird cousin I'm always trying to avoid? There's also the fact that transit is by its very nature multimodal. Every transit trip starts as a walking trip, and a lot of transit trips could start as cycling trips. But without high quality cycling and walking directions, you just get more problems. And of course, the issues with cycling and walking are much the same as transit. The real world conditions, which often feel unsafe or not very well protected from the weather, often differ from what the fastest route you might expect is if you just look at a map of nodes and connections. Now, that's not to say that there aren't good transit apps. Especially when you look at different cities, there are often great options, but they tend to be super localized. For example, Not Just Bikes raved about the SBB app on his recent trip to Switzerland. But having an app that's that great is something that's going to be dependent on a transit agency that has a lot of resources and already has a lot of its problems fixed. And I just don't think that kind of app is going to be something that you can see consistently localized for every transit system. Now, all of this isn't to say that there aren't good generalized transit apps. I've personally used Transit and Rocketman fairly regularly, and I know some people swear by Citymapper, but ultimately, I just think that to have a truly great transit app, we need something completely different from the format we see today. And that's all about recognizing how transit is different than driving. Thanks for watching.